All that is required is that they hold those general principles on this head of doctrine which are implied in or are necessary to support the express approvals of the national reformation and condemnations of the national deformation, which formed so prominent a part of their public profession, and by which they were from the first distinguished as seceders. It will not be expected that I should enter here into an examination of the accusations brought against Presbyterians as chargeable with intolerant and persecuting proceedings during the period of the Solemn League. I confine myself to the following general observations. In the first place, seceders never pledged themselves by an approbation of all the acts and proceedings either of the state or of the church during that period. Their approbation of them was limited. Act and Testimony, page 62. So far as it can be shown that any acts of the church encroached on due Christian liberty, or that any acts of the state subjected good and peaceable subjects to be punished for matters purely religious, or imposed on them hardships which did not necessarily result from measures requisite to promote the public good and preserve the national safety, the principles of seceders do not permit them to justify the conduct of the Covenanters. In the second place, the charges on this head are in some instances groundless, and in others greatly exaggerated. The fact is that this period of the history of Britain has been most grossly misinterpreted, and erroneous and distorted views of the great transactions by which it was distinguished, and of the characters and actions of the men who were principally engaged in them, have at last become general and, in some points, almost universal. And here a footnote. I cannot help saying that Presbyterians have shown themselves strangely negligent in counteracting these false views, and I wish I had no reason for adding that they have suffered for their supineness by becoming the dupes of misrepresentation. Mr. Neal's History of the Puritans, a work which has been extensively read, affords a striking exemplification of this. Examinations of it, or counterstatements in those instances in which they considered their connections as injured by the author, have been published by Episcopalians, Baptists, Quakers, and Socinians. Nothing of this kind has appeared from Presbyterians, although it might easily be shown that they had as much ground for complaint as any of the parties mentioned. The general merits of that work should have been an inducement to them to point out its mistakes, which were more readily credited than the grosser errors of less informed and more prejudiced writers. I can only give one instance here. After stating the Presbyterian opinion concerning the power of the keys, or of church government, he adds, "The Independents claimed a like power for the brotherhood of every particular congregation, but without any civil sanctions or penalties annexed." Now, the annexation of civil penalties did not enter into the claim of Presbyterians in their disputes in favor of the divine right of church government in general, or of presbytery, but if it had entered into their claim, as I grant some of them in their writings have indicated the propriety of the annexation, still it would have formed no distinction between them and the Independents, the latter themselves being judges. If the magistrate's power, to which we give as much, and, as we think, more than the principles of presbyterial government will suffer them to yield, do but assist and back the sentence of other churches denouncing this non-communion against churches miscarrying, according to the nature of the crime, as they judge meet, then, without all controversy, this our way of church proceeding will be every way as effectual as their other can be supposed to be. By the most, the nature of the cause in which the Covenanters were embarked, the enemies by whom they were opposed, and the dangers with which they were surrounded, are not understood or not duly adverted to. The work to which they were called did not consist in the correction of simple errors in doctrine or corruptions which merely affected worship, ecclesiastical discipline, and Christian morals. It had for its object the removal of evils which are hurtful, both in a religious and political view, and by which the liberties of church and state were equally affected. Prelacy was not only a deviation from the institution of Christ, which was to be confuted and removed by an appeal to scriptural authority and argument, but secular power, external violence, and political tyranny were annexed to it, and interwoven with the whole form and proceedings of the hierarchy. Bishops were not only domineering lords in the church, They were also tools in the hands of arbitrary monarchs and persecuting statesmen. Again, these evils were owing in a great measure to the exorbitant prerogative of the crown, from which, in consequence of the ecclesiastical supremacy vested in it, arose the arbitrary proceedings of the bishops' courts and the illegal powers of the High Commission. While the ecclesiastical grievances sprung from political abuses, the political grievances might be traced, in their turn, to ecclesiastical abuses, and religion and policy equally demanded the correction of both. The cooperation of the several powers and of the means competent to them was therefore requisite. The use of religious means was primarily needful for giving life and animation to the work, but these alone could not redress all grievances. Means of a very different kind were necessary to restrain violence, to curb tyranny, to abolish the laws authorizing the evils complained of, and to substitute others in their place. If forcible opposition was made to this, or if conspiracies and factions were formed for the maintenance or restitution of the old oppressive system, it was necessary to employ law and penalties for restraining or suppressing such attempts. In conducting any common measures having for their object the general good of society, civil or ecclesiastical, it is impossible altogether to avoid interfering with private liberty or subjecting individuals to hardships and restraints which in some way affect their consciences and the full enjoyment of their religious privileges. Undeniable examples of this in recent times might be produced from the proceedings of religious societies which have no immediate connection with government. In the prosecution of the complex reformation in which our forefathers were engaged, opposed as it was by such adversaries as we have described, and while an intestine war raged in the country, it was not only extremely difficult for them to steer an even course, but it was impossible for them to avoid imposing restraints which would have been improper in an ordinary state of affairs. And, tenderness apart, we ought to be cautious in censuring their conduct, as it may turn out an accurate knowledge of all the facts, that measure which at first view appeared intolerant or unreasonably severe, were indispensably necessary to the public safety. Nor should we overlook the character and designs of the sectaries who arose on the suppression of the arbitrary and malignant party, and whose claims on the head of liberty of conscience were resisted by men decidedly adverse to the use of force in religious matters, as dangerous to the religion, liberties, and peace of the three kingdoms. Here a footnote. See the lives of Gattaker and Lightfoot in Biographia Britannica, Volume 4, page 2166, as well as Volume 5, page 3293. If the state of parties and the circumstances of the time be narrowly investigated, it will appear, I think, that the public proceedings, so far from being obnoxious to the charge of persecution, were upon the whole marked with uncommon lenity and tenderness, even amidst open war, and the plots and cabals of factions, political and religious. And that period, instead of being distinguished by restrictions on opinions and practices, was rather noted for the relaxation of ecclesiastical discipline and general laws, and for a more licentious freedom and greater diversity of religion than ever prevailed in any period of British history.